So we have some seriously bad news about the RTX 3080, and I'm sure the 3090 is also going to be experiencing these same issues. And these issues actually match up to what everyone has been experiencing with all the game crashes, and we actually captured it firsthand. There's been some crashes when people are playing games with the 3080, and no doubt the 3090 is going to have the same issues when people start receiving them over the coming days. But I wanted to talk about what may have been causing these issues we experienced, but also how this issue only happened and why it only happened at lower resolutions like 1080p and 1440p, which really is what most people game at. So I was working on the 3080 benchmarks last night, and that's when we experienced these issues. I was on the phone with Brian from Tech Yes City for about 2 hours, and we're trying to figure this out together. So what we ended up doing was we swapped out components. We also downclocked the CPU, overclocked the CPU, and also changed the RAM speeds as well. Unfortunately, swapping everything out like that, overclocking, underclocking, wasn't really enough to get past all of these benchmarks that we were, having these issues with. So this morning we built this absolute beast of a system right here. I know it's definitely standing out compared to some of the other computers that we build. Right here, we just built a quick test bench. As you can see, we have all 3 power connectors on separate rails for the power supply as well for the cleanest power delivery possible. But unfortunately, we were still experiencing the same issues. So something weird, and I don't know if this was a luck of the draw run, but when we downclocked the CPU, we experienced a crash almost immediately. But when we overclocked, we were able to make it through 2 of our 3 games in 1080p. So at that point, I wasn't sure if there was a difference between the bottleneck or something between the CPU and the GPU, because as we've seen with benchmarks, the CPU is actually limiting the GPU's performance in 1080p, and obviously it performs a lot better at higher resolutions. Was the GPU trying to perform past its limitation of what the CPU would let it perform, and therefore it was creating some instability and creating these crashes? It's hard to say because, 1080p, that's where all the issues were occurring all of the time. 1440p, a couple of issues here and there. 4K was very smooth. So we kind of narrowed it down to having something to do with turbo boosting and some instability. So we ended up going to bed. We woke up this morning with an article from Igor's lab, and this kind of confirmed all of our suspicions that we were working on overnight. And they actually pointed this down to AIBs cheaping out on some of the capacitors which are on the back of the GPUs. Now, as you can see in this photo here, NVIDIA Founders 3080 has 4 of the cheaper style capacitors and 2 of the more premium capacitors, and their job is to act sort of like a filter to reduce some noise and interference to provide the GPU with cleaner power. Now, some of the companies have decided to go with some of the cheaper capacitors to save on costs, but they're not performing their job correctly. What we've seen is GPU boost is kicking in when we're running these titles, and this is pushing those capacitors to their limits. It's introducing extra noise, and it's making these capacitors very sensitive, and that's what's causing these game crashes. The interesting thing here is that MSI have actually used a more expensive capacitor, unlike a lot of the other AIBs. This gets me thinking that perhaps one isn't enough. The NVIDIA Founders 3080 uses 2 of these more premium capacitors, and the AIBs had the freedom of making their own cards how they pleased, as long as it reached NVIDIA's minimum spec. So let's actually give you guys a bit of a live demo to show you guys exactly what is happening. So for those of you who don't know, Metro Exodus actually has a built-in benchmark. You need to go to the program files and find Metro Exodus, and you can open that benchmark up. Now, we're only testing in the high preset. We've got it 1920 by 1080. Ray tracing, DLSS are both off. So usually what we'll do is hit run, and then we would wait and see what happens. Usually it will crash. In fact, all of the time it would crash. But yeah, so we'll show you guys a bit of a live demo of exactly what happens. It does get through a lot of the benchmark, but then eventually will crash. Now this happened with Shadow of the Tomb Raider and Red Dead Redemption 2 as well. It's just, when we did overclock the CPU, We were able to get through Red Dead Redemption and Shadow of the Tomb Raider, but we weren't able to get through this. So I think that this game is perhaps a bit more taxing on the power limits. So this is what we're going to use to show you guys the example of. As you can see, it's running. One other thing that I did notice was a bit of inconsistency up here between the NVIDIA FPS counter and the in-game counter. That seems a bit weird because I can see this at 150, 160 FPS, and then this jumps up to 200 for a second. So there's a bit of inconsistency there. But as you can see, the game has frozen, and then we will get the crash come up. I wish this notice would go away, but yeah. So the game has crashed, and here you go. So crash has been detected. Blah blah blah. The crash that Shadow of the Tomb Raider gave was actually pretty interesting, and I'll put a picture of that up on the screen for you guys to actually have a read of, but that's what sort of maybe suggested that the CPU was not providing enough power and sort of bottlenecking the GPU, and so that's why we tried to overclock the CPU, which actually did work for the game. Whether or not that was just a bit of luck that it made that run, I have no idea. Now, how can we actually fix this issue? Well, I think that the issue is with the power delivery and it reaching its limits. I think that until we have some sort of patching from NVIDIA, the only way to combat this issue would be to perhaps slide the power limit down in MSI Afterburner and perhaps downclock the GPU, maybe 50 megahertz or something like that, just so that it's not running at its max and therefore you're still able to play games. So I've not actually tried this, so let's actually give you guys a live demo of trying that and see if that actually fixes the issue. So as you guys can see, we've got MSI Afterburner open. Let's go ahead and lower this power limit to 95, and then we'll go down to the core clock and we'll go -50, enter that, and so now our GPU is running slower than what it should be. Let's go ahead and we'll give Metro Exodus another run. And there you have it. It actually completed the run. We've got our results here. Average of 131 FPS. Either way, I think ARBs can't really get away with just one of these more premium capacitors. I think they really should have followed NVIDIA's footsteps and added two. We're only now seeing these issues because the 3080 reviews were mostly done with the NVIDIA Founders cards, and obviously they had the two premium capacitors. Now that all of these are hitting the markets and reviewers are getting a hold of them, people out in the community are getting a hold of them, we're seeing issues arise more and more. I'm sure this is going to happen with the 3090 as well. We'll be able to test that next week once we receive it. Now, I don't think everyone's going to be having the same issues as what we are experiencing and others out in the community are experiencing. For instance, we test this on a test bench and we also test it in an open case design. Now this ensures that it has great airflow. It's got nice cool air around. If this graphics card was stuck inside of a normal computer case with the window closed, it could get a lot hotter in there and that may limit its performance, and therefore it's not actually reaching those, power limits and everything, because it might get throttled down a tiny bit, and yeah, so GPU boost wouldn't kick in as if it would with all of this nice, fresh, clean, cool air. Now this is certainly something that needs to be addressed. I don't think there will be a recall. What I think will happen is there will be some sort of patching from NVIDIA. Obviously a recall would be very costly for them. So I think they'll introduce a bit of patching or something like that, which will downclock either the power limit or the speeds or something like that. Technically, GPU boost goes beyond the NVIDIA spec anyway, so they're not really entitled to give you guys a refund or anything like that, but there will be some issues which NVIDIA will have to fix. Anyway, guys, I hope you all appreciate this video. It was an interesting one, on the phone with Tech Yes City last night. It was just confusing us like crazy, overclocking there, because we were getting messages pop up saying that, other hardware was not able to provide the performance for the GPU, and display driver issues and things like that. We tested all of that, changed all of that around, and so we thought maybe overclocking the CPU was going to fix the issue, which it did in 2 of our games. We were able to run it and we made it past, but Metro Exodus seemed to be the big test for us, and we could never make it past, even with the overclocked CPU. So it's glad that we were able to narrow down the issue, and then it was all confirmed this morning, which made me super happy because we were meant to have our 3080, 3090 benchmarks out live, but of course this introduced, a lot of issues and delay. So yeah, we'll be receiving our 3090 next week. I look forward to getting a build out for you guys. We have the build ready. All we had to do was slot in the GPU and we're good to go and test it out. But I don't want to show you guys the build yet. Anyway, guys, thanks for watching. I hope you all enjoyed. I know this is a bit different than normal, but consumers have a right to know what is going on, especially if they're experiencing the same issues, because it should not be happening. Anyway, guys, appreciate you all. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you all in the next one.